with the international community in demanding an end to the 61-year-long embargo and full adherence to the principles and purposes enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations and to the norms of international law, including those relating to mutual respect and non-interference in the internal affairs of states. Currently, over 190 nations engage economically and politically with Cuba, while the United States remain alone in pursuing its unjustified and illegal economic sanctions policy. Consequently, non-member states once again urge the U.S. government to yield to the will of the overwhelming majority of the international community and rectify its failed policies to fully complying with all relevant resolutions of the General Assembly, which call for the immediate and complete end to the embargo imposed against Cuba. In conclusion, the non-aligned movement, while reiterating its commitment to the promotion, preservation, and strengthening of multilateralism, reaffirms that the full respect of the purposes and principles of the Charter of the United Nations, particularly those referring to sovereign equality, non-interference, and non-intervention, is critical for the effective maintenance of international peace and security. Therefore, the international community must continue working together on the reversal and elimination of the economic, commercial, and financial blockade imposed by the United States against Cuba, given inter alia its illegal character and its extraterritorial implications. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Azerbaijan. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Zambia, speaking on behalf of the African Group.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the Group of African States on the agenda item entitled Necessity of Ending Economic, Commercial, Financial Embargo Imposed by the United States of America against Cuba. This matter continues to be of great importance and concern to the Africa Group, and indeed to Africa as a whole. For the 14th time, our heads of state and government at the 36th ordinary session of the AU Assembly held in February reiterated their position calling for the lifting of sanctions on Cuba's people and government. The African Group reiterates its position that the illegal sanctions, particularly the implementation of Title III of the Helms-Burton Act, are the main obstacles to Cuba's realization of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. We see also as a matter of severe concern the unjust inclusion of Cuba by the United States on the list of countries that allegedly support terrorism, which has further exacerbated the financial restrictions to Cuba emanating from this embargo. This inclusion, Mr. President, has no real basis. We therefore call for the removal of Cuba from this list. As Africa has consistently been concerned about Cuba's dilemma because of the importance it attaches to the achievement of the objectives of the 2030 Agenda. As a responsible member of the international community, Cuba has made numerous positive contributions over the decades to Africa and many other states and peoples of the world. The adoption of the annual resolution to end Cuba's blockade by the United States has for 30 years, represented a call to all countries. The African Group will continue to reaffirm its full support for the draft resolution and further wishes to express its regret about the setback in the bilateral relations between Cuba and the United States. We call on the United States government to work towards restoring positive relations and lifting the long-standing blockade imposed on the people and the government of Cuba. The Africa Group wishes to reiterate that it will remain firm in its principled position of total solidarity with Cuba, its people, and its government, while calling for the immediate end to the economic, commercial, and financial blockade. Mr. President, the Africa Group supports this resolution. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Zambia. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Mexico.
Señor Presidente,
President, Excellencies, I welcome the presence at the outset of Minister Bruno Rodriguez. A month ago, in this same chamber, the Mexican Foreign Minister Alicia Bárcena called for an end to abhorrent and unjustifiable situations. We today reiterate this call and call for an end to the embargo against Cuba, since it runs counter to international law and is alien to the values which underpin peaceful coexistence between peoples in the Americas and the Caribbean. Mexico categorically condemns the economic, commercial, and financial embargo imposed for over 6 decades against Cuba, as well as the decision to apply Title III of the Cuban Liberty and Democratic Solidarity Act, which has affected not only the sovereignty of the Cuban people, but also the national interest of third countries. Given the severe economic situation caused by the effects of COVID-19, the high prices of oil, and the consequences of natural disasters, it is vital to bring an end to this blockade. Only thus can we reverse the difficult economic and social situation faced by the Cuban people and take a decisive step towards consolidating a hemisphere which is more prosperous and competitive, but above all, more just and peaceful. In the same vein, Mexico, my country, deems the inclusion of Cuba on the list of state sponsors of terrorism by the United States State Department to have caused incalculable negative consequences for the Cuban economic and social development. Restrictions upon exports, the elimination of specific commercial benefits, encumbrances to humanitarian assistance, and obstacles in obtaining loans from international financial institutions are all unjustifiable and unjust measures which must be suspended. President, as said by the President of Mexico, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, the relationship with Latin America and the Caribbean is a priority for the Mexican government. We have therefore worked assiduously to shore up the processes of integration, to open up dialogue, and to cooperate with countries of our region. Mexico reiterates the fact that in the relations between sovereign nations, any unilateral measure designed as a means of political pressure to achieve changes in the internal affairs of another state from the outside runs counter to the principles of the Charter of the United Nations and jeopardizes peace between peoples. We absolutely maintain that there should be no unilateral sanctions of any kind other than those adopted in the Security Council of the United Nations, and we once again express our strong support to Cuba, a country which Mexico will continue to work with, shoulder to shoulder, to overcome the common challenges through cooperation, dialogue, and regional integration. Latin America and the Caribbean is a diverse region, but with a spirit of unity which must be strengthened and not weakened by unilateral policies. We therefore call upon the government of the United States to bring an end to the embargo immediately and to foster dialogue to resolve its differences with Cuba. The international community owes the Cuban people the opportunity to prosper in a climate of peace and cooperation. It is time to open a new chapter and to allow Cuba to fully participate in the global community without the restrictions that are imposed by this unjust and inhumane blockade. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Mexico. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Namibia.
President, my delegation aligns itself with the statements delivered by Zambia on behalf of the African Group and Uganda on behalf of the G77 and China. Namibia reaffirms its unwavering commitment to advocating for the lifting of the unjust embargo against Cuba, which has endured for over 6 decades. As a result of this, more than 80% of the country's current population was born under the blockade. It is imperative that the people of Cuba are granted their rightful access to a dignified life, unburdened by constraints that impede their nation's progress. Namibia stands in resolute solidarity with Cuba, persistently supporting its endeavors to end the economic and financial sanctions imposed by the United States. We strongly denounce the labeling of Cuba as a state sponsor of international terrorism by the American government and reiterate our long-standing call for its removal from this list, as such a categorization lacks justification. Cuba is viewed by Namibia, along with many other nations worldwide, as a proponent of global peace and unity. This is most expressly felt in Cuba's bilateral actions, which exemplify goodwill, harmony, and a commitment to fostering international peace and cooperation. Your Excellencies, during the high-level week of the 70th session of the United Nations Assembly, His Excellency Dr. Hage Geingob, President of the Republic of Namibia, strongly denounced the economic, commercial, and financial blockade imposed by the United States on Cuba, and he once again urged the removal of the country from this unilaterally decreed list of state sponsors of terrorism. These inhumane sanctions pose a significant hindrance to the progress of development initiatives.
His Excellency Dr. Geingob further emphasized that lifting these sanctions would enhance the Cuban populace's quality of life and foster economic and social advancement. We recognize that since 1992, the General Assembly has consistently voted in favor of resolutions urging the cessation of the embargo on the country. We firmly believe that the failure to implement these resolutions, including their previous iterations, fully will erode the principles of multilateralism and continue to contribute to undermining the credibility of the United Nations. Consequently, we call upon the international community to intensify their efforts towards realizing the objective of lifting the economic and financial embargo. Your Excellencies, the persistent economic blockade has created significant obstacles for the people of Cuba. Namibia continues to express deep concern and disappointment at the severe and inhumane treatment of Cuba. The ongoing economic blockade has led to the disruption of vital services, notably the supply of medical resources, which are essential for the well-being of Cubans and contributed adversely to the attainment for their developmental aspirations. Excellencies, the bond between Namibia and Cuba remains robust. Cuba was a steadfast ally to Namibia during our fight for independence. In this spirit, we pay tribute to our Cuban brothers and sisters for their courageous sacrifices that played a pivotal role in securing our freedom. In conclusion, Mr. President, Namibia once again reaffirms its unwavering support for the people of Cuba and their cause against the blockade. We encourage the United States to begin a dialogue with Cuba based on the equality of states and respect for sovereignty and independence. This, we believe, will pave the way for a new era marked by improved relations between the two countries, ushering a brighter future for both. My delegation will vote in favor of the resolution, just as we have in previous years. We look forward to the adoption of the draft resolution on the necessity of ending the economic, commercial, and financial embargo imposed by the United States of America against Cuba, with strong support from all delegations in furtherance of their commitments to the principles of the United Nations Charter and the spirit of leaving no one behind. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Namibia. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela.
Señor Presidente,
Mr. President, the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela is grateful for the convening of this plenary meeting to take up a topic to which our delegation attaches particular importance. We'd also like to convey our affectionate greetings to His Excellency Bruno Rodriguez Parilla, Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Cuba, who is here with us today. Our delegation also subscribes to the statements made by the delegations of Uganda, Azerbaijan, San Vicente and the Grenadines, and Eritrea. Mr. President, we have no doubt that this will be the 31st consecutive year that this General Assembly will reiterate its almost universal call in favor of the lifting of the economic, commercial, and financial blockade to which for over 60 years the Brethren Republic of Cuba has resisted with great courage, conscience, and a sense of patriotic unity, always keeping its head held high without bowing to blackmail or taking down its revolutionary banner. This is a blockade that is illegal because it violates all norms of international law and the principles enshrined in the founding charter of this organization. This is a blockade that is a criminal because it generates death,
pain, and indiscriminate suffering of an entire people. This is a blockade that is inhumane because it deliberately and systematically violates the human rights of over 11 million Cubans, and that today represents the main obstacle for the achievement of its inalienable right to development. This is a blockade that represents a collective punishment that deepens inequalities, social exclusion, and systemic racism, and whose pernicious effects are clear crimes against humanity. This is a policy of maximum pressure to which no Cuban family is immune, and that could be compared to a declaration of war, given that this economic aggression, as is well known and has been amply documented, has an impact that is as destructive and lethal as those generated by conventional wars. This criminal blockade is also constitutes a policy of economic terrorism that, due to its extraterritoriality, affects any country or entity that seeks to maintain legally and in a sovereign fashion economic, commercial, or financial relations with the Brethren Republic of Cuba. While at the same time the blockade prevents the Cuban state from having access to the international financial system, as well as gaining credit facilities, financing facilities, including for its development. What it isn't, in spite of the affirmations of the U.S. government to try to justify its aggression, what it isn't is a simply bilateral matter or an embargo directed exclude, because this anachronistic and erroneous policy affects the entire international community. Even worse, this is a blockade that has been expanded and worsened in recent years after the activation of Title III of the Helms-Burton Law and the arbitrary inclusion of Cuba in a unilateral list that qualifies it as a supposed promoter of terrorism. Mr. President, in spite of all the above, the imperial policy of the United States has not managed, or nor will it ever manage to achieve its goals in the socialist Cuba of Martí, in the revolutionary Cuba of Fidel, because the people of this brethren country is determined to exercise its inalienable right to self-determination and to define in a free, independent, and sovereign way its political, economic, social, and cultural system. In spite of all the above, Cuba continues today to renovate its humanist mission and its spirit of cooperation and solidarity by providing support and technical assistance in a disinterested way to a large number of countries, including Venezuela, in various areas such as education, sports, health, culture, and many others. Cuba has taught us, not by preaching, but by its actions, the true meaning of solidarity. To give what we have plenty of, but what we lack. It is difficult for today's generation to forget the contributions of the dozens of brigades of Cuban doctors that were deployed for many years at over 35 countries in Africa, Latin America, the Caribbean, the Middle East, and Europe to save the lives of millions of people during the recent COVID-19 pandemic. It will also be impossible to forget how, through its own efforts, and in spite of the difficulties imposed by this criminal blockade, Cuba managed to develop 5 vaccines against COVID-19, in which it put at the disposal of entire peoples. That is the great contrast between the humanist vision of our sister Cuba and the supremacist and imperial vision of the United States, whose government has recklessly tasked thousands of officials to extort dozens of countries that are experiencing disease and suffering. We have to ask ourselves how much more Cuba could give us, how much more it could offer to expand its international cooperation if all the hurdles that have been imposed on it illegally in an arbitrary way over the past 60 years would have been lifted. How many more resolutions does this General Assembly have to adopt so that an end is put to this criminal blockade? Perhaps we haven't understood well enough that today's world doesn't need blockades or unilateralism. Mr. President, the obsolete, unjust, illegal, and cruel policy of asphyxiation imposed by the United States against Cuba through this illegal blockade represents a system of unilateral coercive measures that is the most unjust, severe, and prolonged that has ever been applied against any country in modern history. According to official figures, these past 6 decades, the blockade has resulted in losses that exceed $159 billion, to which is to be added an unimaginable human cost. All this is mentioned in the most recent report of the Secretary General. This is a true crime that affects all of us equally, because this is the denial of political, economic, and cultural diversity of this planet. It's a denial of our right to national sovereignty. Even worse, this is an attack against an entire system of international relations with which Washington is seeking to impose its dominion on the rights of hundreds of countries. So I would like to make an appeal that we must demand that the government of the United States respect the Charter of the United Nations, respect international law, and that it put an end to any measure that threatens international peace and security, including the criminal application of blockades and other arbitrary and unilateral measures, such as the inclusion of Cuba in a list in which it should never have been listed, and even today categorizes it as a supposed promoter of terrorism, when in fact, in reality, and in fact, it is the government of the United States that not only promotes this despicable scourge, but in fact protects and even offers safe haven to its perpetrators. Mr. President, the time has come that once and for all, the clamor of the immense majority is heeded. A majority that in unison demands the immediate and definitive end to all misleadingly named sanctions regimes, including the embargo against Cuba. It is time to put an end to double standards and the application of international justice and in promotion of the rule of law and in protection of human rights. We shouldn't continue to tolerate violations committed up to now in complete impunity by regimes that, contemptuous towards global opinion, have converted this state, the United States, into the most isolated state in the world, whose harmful actions do damage to the well-being of our peoples and their right to live in peace and in development. Mr. President, when tomorrow the draft resolution contained in document A/78 /L5 will be submitted for consideration, our country will not be able to vote in favor of this text due to precisely the application of a criminal blockade imposed illegally against Venezuela by the United States. However, we strongly and decisively support this draft resolution and would like to conclude our intervention to vote massively in favor of this draft, to vote in favor of this document, whose operative paragraphs we hope will lead to concrete actions that will lead to an urgent lifting of the blockade, is to vote in favor of the independence of Cuba. It is to vote in favor of international legality and multilateralism. And lastly, and no less importantly, it is vote in favor of the end of neo-colonial projects of attempted domination and oppression, using embargoes and unilateral sanctions that have no place in 21st century and ultimately will be condemned to failure. Let us then continue to overwhelmingly support the heroic people of Cuba in its just demands. Cuba, yes, blockade, no. Hasta la victoria siempre. To victory always. Thank you very much.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of China.
Mr. President, China welcomes Foreign Minister Rodriguez to today's meeting and aligns itself with the statement made by the representative of Uganda on behalf of G77 and China. The midterm review of the 2030 agenda was conducted this year. At the SDG summit, world leaders called on the international community to strengthen unity and cooperation, take urgent actions to accelerate the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals so that no country or person is left behind. However, the United States and a few Western countries have engaged in unilateralism, protectionism, and bullying, and refused to fulfill their ODA commitments. They have instead spent large amounts of money on purchasing and exporting weapons, fueling geopolitical conflicts. Many developing countries are faced with an increasingly worsened external environment. The imposition of unilateral coercive measures against Cuba and other countries by the United States constitute a violation of the purposes and principles of the UN Charter. These actions have seriously undermined the international consensus on the 2030 agenda, seriously damaged the rights to survival and development of the people of Cuba and other countries, and seriously undermined peace, development, and win-win cooperation. They run counter to the international trends and have seriously hindered the efforts of all countries to implement the SDG, therefore must be stopped immediately. Since 1992, for over 30 consecutive years, the UNGA has passed the resolution on ending the economic, commercial, and financial embargo imposed by the United States of America against Cuba. With an overwhelming majority, the resolution urges all countries to abide by the UN Charter and the norms of international law, and to revoke or abolish any laws and measures that has extraterritorial implications, which affect the sovereignty of other countries and the legitimate rights and interests of entities and individuals within their jurisdiction, and the freedom of trade and shipping. These represent the just call and strong desire of the international community, which must be effectively implemented. According to relevant statistics, the over 6-decade-long U.S. embargo has caused a cumulative loss of nearly $160 billion to Cuba, affecting areas that touches upon people's livelihoods such as fuel, food, daily necessities, medicines, resulting in serious humanitarian disasters. From March 2022 to February 2023 alone, the embargo has caused losses of $4.867 billion, equivalent to 3 years of food rations for the entire Cuban people. These facts and figures are alarming, and the international community must not turn a blind eye on this and should condemn them with one voice. It is gratifying to see that the government and people of Cuba have never succumbed to the unilateralism and hegemony of the United States. Despite the tremendous pressure and huge losses caused by the embargo, active efforts are still being made to promote global solidarity and international cooperation. This year, Cuba has played a leading role in promoting South-South cooperation while serving as the chairman of G77 and China. It has also successfully hosted the G77 and China Havana Summit and has helped build important consensus for developing countries to work together in coping with multiple challenges. China deeply appreciates these efforts. Mr. President, All countries in this world formed a community with a shared future. China has always advocated for respecting the rights of countries to independently choose their social systems and development paths, maintaining the international order based on international law, defending international fairness and justice, and opposing the use of military, political, economic, or other means to impose unilateral coercive measures on other countries. China strongly urges the United States to immediately and comprehensively lift its economic, commercial, and financial embargo against Cuba, and to develop normal relations with other member states in accordance with the purposes and principles of the UN Charter and the basic norms governing international relations, as this is in line with the common interest of the people of both the United States and Cuba, and is also conducive to regional peace and stability. China will once again vote in favor of the draft resolution submitted by Cuba under this agenda item. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of China. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of South Africa.
Thank you, Mr. President. We recognize the presence of His Excellency Bruno Rodriguez Parilla, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Cuba. South Africa aligns itself with the statements delivered by the Africa Group, the Non-Aligned Movement, and the Group of 77 and China. Mr. President, we reiterate our principled support for this resolution and call once more on the United States to heed the almost unanimous call by member states to end its blockade of Cuba, which has impeded its right to development. The Secretary General's report has again highlighted the terrible impact that this embargo has had on Cuba and her people. This remains a grave violation of international law and the principles enshrined in the UN Charter, and such unilateral action cannot be justified. Mr. President, the South African government and people acknowledge with deep humility the sacrifices made by the Cuban people with their lives to fight for South Africa's liberation. We pay tribute to Cuba's selfless generosity and distinguished record in helping those in need around the world in health, education, emergency relief, and development, especially in Africa. This they do despite the economic blockade. Cuba champions the rights of developing countries, and it too has an undeniable right to develop and prosper. Mr. President, South Africa reiterates its unwavering call on the United States to remove this unjust burden of sanctions and to opt for constructive dialogue with Cuba, not its further isolation. South Africa joins the overwhelming majority of United Nations member states in calling for a new chapter of hope for Cuba and its people. The South African government remains concerned about the destructive impact that the United States embargo has on the lives and livelihoods of the people of Cuba, especially the poor and vulnerable, and amidst the mounting global food and fuel crisis. The U.S. designation of Cuba as a state sponsor of terrorism, together with the continued full application of the Helms-Burton Act, including the authorization to file lawsuits in U.S. courts under its Title III, further hinders Cuba's economic, commercial, and financial relations with third countries. the designation is unfounded, and we call for the removal of Cuba from this list, which is aimed at further punitive actions. Mr. President, United States sanctions represents major impediment for South African companies in conducting business with Cuba. Nevertheless, the relations between South Africa and Cuba continue to serve as a successful model of South-South cooperation. South Africa has recommitted to expanding its existing bilateral cooperation programs with Cuba, as well as to pursue new areas of cooperation, such as in infrastructure development, agriculture, and science and technology. The United States embargo remains the most significant obstacle for Cuba in its quest to realize its development objectives, including the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. United States sanctions have caused major economic difficulties for Cuba, including shortages of essential items such as food, fuel, medicines, and other necessities. South Africa commends those countries that have taken measures to mitigate the specific effects of the Helms-Burton Act and requests third-party countries to scrap any domestic laws or regulations that continue to hamper the development of Cuba and its people. The global commitment to implementing the 2030 Agenda remains in jeopardy when the embargo prevents a member state from fairly participating in its own socio-economic development. South Africa appeals once again to the international community to redouble its efforts to implement all the UN resolutions already adopted by the UN, and for the US to end its embargo. As we all pursue implementation of sustainable development goals, it is incumbent upon us to ensure that no one is left behind, including our brothers and sisters in Cuba. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of South Africa. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Ethiopia.
Thank you, Mr. President. Ethiopia Allah and selfie statement delivered by Uganda on behalf of Group of 77 in China. Azerbaijan and Zambia on behalf of Non-Aligned Movement and the Group of African Group. Unilateral coercive measure constitutes a flagrant violation of the principles of national law as set forth in the UN Charter and the subsequent resolutions. It obstructs friendly relations between states as well as international cooperation and development, security, and human rights. The economic, commercial, and financial embargo imposed against Cuba that unlawfully spanned for 6 decades prevented the Cuban economy from tapping its full potential to achieve sustainable growth and development. Because of this coercive measure, the Cuban people continue to face economic hardship and humanitarian challenge. And the world couldn't benefit from the Cuba scientific advancements and its achievement in various fields. Mr. President, unilateral coercive measure undermine the policy freedom of the states to achieve their development objectives and meet their people's needs. States subject to such measures put a disadvantage in their efforts to overcome challenge, including climate change, socio-economic crisis, pandemics, and transnational security threats. Even with their admirable level of resilience, the unilateral embargo and additional coercive measures imposed on Cuba have caused heavy toll on the well-being of the Cuban people. Ethiopia reiterates its call for lifting of this embargo. Finally, Ethiopia also encourages the open and constructive dialogue between the United States and Cuba, which we believe paves the way for the swift lifting of the embargo. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Ethiopia. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Argentina.
Muchas gracias, señor.
Thank you very much, President. We greet the Foreign Minister of Cuba, Bruno Rodriguez Padilla, here today. Argentina aligned itself with the statements made by the G77 in China and CELAC. Argentina robustly opposes the use of unilateral coercive measures and the adoption of discriminatory commercial practices. My country has traditionally rejected the policy of a blockade against Cuba, as imposed by the United States of America, for over half a century, which, as well as being morally unjustifiable, violates the Charter of the United Nations, norms of international law, and the spirit of multilateralism. Argentina renews its absolute commitment to the principles of the sovereign equality of states, non-intervention in internal affairs, and freedom of international commerce and navigation. The blockade is immoral, unjust, and illegal. President, let me be clear. The perpetuation of the blockade against Cuba is inadmissible. Year upon year, this General Assembly calls practically unanimously for the necessity of bringing an end to this blockade. It is very clear.
¿Estamos todos bien?
Is everybody okay?
Claro para la comunidad.
It is very clear for the international community that this blockade is the main obstacle in the way of economic and social development for the Cuban people. In today's complex international context, the blockade imposed upon Cuba has become more inhumane and unjustifiable than ever. And the only thing it has generated is suffering and deprivation for the Cuban people. The blockade has serious economic and humanitarian costs which cause irreparable damage to the well-being of the Cuban people. Indeed, the blockade hampers the enjoyment of basic rights such as health, education, and food, education, tourism, transport, industry, and culture, to mention just a few. It also causes damage in all spheres of the country's economy. It acts as a barrier to granting the country of loans under favorable conditions, as well as transferring technology, cutting-edge technology, mobilizing external capital, attracting foreign direct investment, protecting the environment, and fully integrating the country into the global economy. We also express our disagreement with the unjust inclusion of Cuba in the list of states which supposedly sponsor terrorism. As well as being an unjustified categorization, this has increased the intimidating effect of the restrictions associated with the blockade and has impinged upon Cuba's possibilities of establishing commercial and financial relations with international partners. In this regard, we urge the government of the United States of America to bring an end to such measures. President, despite the restrictions imposed by the blockade and by these measures that we've just been talking about, Cuba has managed to maintain its protagonism and leadership in various areas of international cooperation and solidarity. Argentina expresses its full support to Cuba and our support for the principle of legal equality of all states with regard to their sovereignty. And Argentina holds that there must be full respect for all these differences, which must prevail whether these differences be economic, political, or of another nature. The blockade against Cuba must cease. It is the most long-standing system of unilateral sanctions against any country. Since 1992, the General Assembly has pronounced itself on an annual basis by an overwhelming majority in favor of respect for international law, complying with the principles and purposes of the Charter of the United Nations and the right of the Cuban people to choose their own destiny. Argentina will vote in favor of the resolution, once again demonstrating our firm opposition of the economic, commercial, and financial embargo imposed against Cuba, as well as the use of unilateral coercive measures, the extraterritorial implementation of national commercial laws, and the adoption of discriminatory commercial practices. We hope not to have to adopt more resolutions of this nature in the future, and that in this way the unjust blockade against Cuba is brought to an end once and for all. Thank you very much.
I thank the distinguished representative of Argentina. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Laos People's Democratic Republic.
Mr. President, my delegation aligns itself with the statements delivered by the distinguished representatives of Azerbaijan, Uganda, and Singapore on behalf of NAM, G77, and China and ASEAN respectively. We echo the sentiments in calling for an immediate end to the economic embargo imposed by the United States of America on Cuba. We thank the Secretary General for his comprehensive report on this important matter, and I join others in extending our warm welcome to His Excellency Bruno Rodriguez Varela, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Cuba, to this august assembly. The Laopida stands firmly in solidarity with the Cuban people, emphasizing that the embargo, which has persisted for over 6 decades, is in direct contradiction to the fundamental principles of the UN Charter and established international norms. This prolonged embargo has inflicted severe hindrances on Cuba's social and economic development, depriving its people of the ability to advance their national development efforts. Mr. President, in the face of the multifaceted challenges confronting our world today, from natural disasters and economic hardships to widespread armed conflicts, it is morally indefensible to impose additional deprivation on the innocent people. Therefore, we stand united with the overwhelmingly majority of UN member states, echoing the necessity of ending economic, commercial, financial embargo against Cuba, as articulated in various UN resolutions. In the current global landscape, marked by uncertainty and crisis, it is more crucial than ever for Cuba, a sovereign UN member state, to determine its own destiny without external interference or hindrances. The Laopida, like many other countries, strongly opposes unilateral coercive measures. Not only do they violate the principles of the UN Charter and international law, but also inflict negative social and economic impacts on innocent civilians, depriving them of their legitimate rights to development. On this note, we reiterate our steadfast support for a global call for an immediate end to unilateral coercive measures imposed on Cuba and remove it from the list of state sponsors of terrorism. In this regard, my delegation will continue to support and vote in favor of the draft resolution A/78/L5 on the necessity of ending the economic, commercial, and financial embargo imposed by the United States of America against Cuba. Mr. President, in conclusion, the Liveindia urges all member states to amplify our collective commitment to foster equitable and sustainable development while safeguarding the legitimate rights of all countries as enshrined in the UN Charter, especially in the midst of this challenging global uncertainty. It is our shared responsibility to ensure that the people of Cuba, like all nations, have the opportunity to thrive and determine their own destiny. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Laos People's Democratic Republic. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Cambodia.
Distinguished delegates, allow me to first of all welcome His Excellency Bruno Rodriguez Parrilla, Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Cuba, to this important session. Cambodia associates itself with the statements delivered in the name of ASEAN, the Group of Friends in Defense of the UN Charter, the G77 in China, and the Non-Aligned Movement. My delegation wishes to join the distinguished delegates in expressing gratitude to the Secretary General for his report, which reflects consistent and overwhelming support of member states for the necessity of ending the economic, commercial, and financial embargo imposed by the United States against Cuba. My delegation wishes to confirm Cambodia's support for this spirit in calling for an end to the unjust embargo on the people of Cuba. Mr. President, Cambodia is firmly committed to the purposes and principles of the Charter of the United Nations, international law, multilateralism, free trade, and other internationally accepted norms. We believe that they serve as the bedrock of a just and equitable global order, peace, stability, security, and development for all to share. We are celebrating the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. And just weeks ago, leader after leader spoke at this august body about the need to revitalize the momentum towards achieving the United Nations Agenda 2030 for Sustainable Development. But the entire people of Cuba are still deprived of their rights to development by decades of embargo unjustly imposed on them by the United States. There is no doubt that the imposition of unilateral sanctions, embargoes, on other cohesive economic measures go against the fundamental principle of the United Nations Charter, the Universal Declaration on Human Rights that we all commit to uphold. The same goes with the extraterritorial extension of the unilateral coercive measures against third countries. They constitute actions that contravene the principles of equal mutual respect for the sovereignty of states, independence, non-interference in the internal affairs of other states, and equal rights to socio-economic development. The United States' unilateral imposition of the economic, commercial, and financial embargo against Cuba has adverse impacts on the lives and livelihoods of the Cuban people, depriving them of means to fully enjoy their fundamental human rights and rights to freedom from all ones. Cambodia is of the view that the blockade over the past 6 decades does not serve the benefit of anyone. The unjust and indiscriminate policy has not only caused hardship to the Cuban people, but also contrary to our commitment to leave no one behind in realizing the Sustainable Development Goals. By law, the United States will contribute positively to the global effort to create a more just, sustainable, prosperous, and peaceful world for all. To conclude, Cambodia remains consistent in joining the international community to stand in solidarity with the government and people of Cuba by voting in favor of this draft resolution on the necessity of ending the economic, commercial, and financial embargo by the United States against Cuba. We call for the United States to immediately lift its unjust blockade on the people of Cuba to allow them to positively and fully contribute to peace, security, and international development. In addition, Cuba should be removed from the list of states sponsoring terrorism. I thank you, Mr. President, for your attention.
I thank the distinguished representative of Cambodia. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Belarus.
Mr. President, the Republic of Belarus would like to subscribe to the statements made on behalf of the Non-Aligned Movement and the Group of Friends in Defense of the UN Charter. We welcome the participation of the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Cuba, Bruno Rodriguez Parilla. The Republic of Belarus is categorically against unilateral coercive measures against UN member states. The pressure put against states using these measures represents the direct intervention into the foreign affairs of sovereign states with the goal of causing maximum economic damage and overthrowing their acting governments. Unilateral restrictions are a gross violation of international law and cause irreparable damage to the entire system of international relations, to the principle of multilateral cooperation, by increasing the potential for conflict and animosity in intergovernmental relations. The continuing trade, financial, and economic blockade of Cuba by the United States is a blatant violation of human rights of all the inhabitants of the island. It represents an act of genocide within the meaning of the 1948 Convention on the Prevention of the Crimes of Genocide and Punishment for it. Restrictions in the area of trade, currency, banking, and tourism sector continue to have a negative impact on the well-being of the Cuban people. The restrictions not only violate human rights, but the authors of these sanctions forfeit any moral right to comment on the situation in the area of human rights in the countries against which they impose restrictions. The consequence of the economic blockade of Cuba restrict the opportunities for economic growth of the country. They limit foreign investment and hamper trade relations with third states, thus violate the legitimate rights of countries to cooperate with Havana fully. We note yet again the lack of progress in resolving this situation, we call on the administration of the United States to reconsider its decision and put a full, unconditional, and irreversible end to the economic, trade, and financial blockade against Cuba. Belarus will vote in favor of this resolution. Thank you for your attention.
I thank the distinguished representative of Belarus. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Algeria.
Monsieur le Président.
President, Algeria aligns itself with the statements already made by the non-aligned movement, the Group of 77 in China, the Group of Friends for the Defense of the Charter of the United Nations, the African Group, and finally the Group for the Islamic Cooperation Organization. And I should like to make this brief statement in my national capacity. Allow me, first of all, though, to welcome the presence here with us of His Excellency Mr. Bruno Rodriguez Parilla, Foreign Affairs Minister of Cuba. Today's debate on the necessity of ending the economic, commercial, and financial embargo imposed by the United States of America against Cuba is a reflection of the great importance of this question, which has continued to mobilize the international community for several sessions of the United Nations General Assembly. In this regard, I seize this opportunity to thank the Secretary General of the United Nations, Mr. Antonio Guterres, for his comprehensive report containing the responses from member states and bodies and organizations of the United Nations, including those from my country, regarding the implementation of Resolution 77-7 on this matter. The adoption every year by the overwhelming majority of member states of the resolution calling for the immediate lifting of the embargo upon Cuba is a very powerful message. It reflects the steadfast support of the international community for the lifting of this unjustified blockade imposed upon Cuba and its people for 6 decades now, in violation of international law and the principles of the Charter of the United Nations. From this tribune, Algeria reiterates its solidarity with Cuba and reaffirms its call for the immediate lifting of this unjustified embargo, which only exacerbates the suffering of a whole people by unjustly depriving them of their fundamental rights. It also hobbles their efforts at development and at achieving the Sustainable Development Programme by 2030. I would like here to recall that Algeria has always called for Cuba, like other member states, being able to benefit from the right to freedom of navigation and commerce, and to exercise its right to extend its commercial and financial exchanges with all other economic partners. In absolute conformity with the position of principle of the non-aligned movement, Algeria will continue to categorically reject the imposition of any unilateral coercive measure or any extraterritorial measures which prevent economic, commercial, and financial development of a member state of the United Nations. The sovereign equality of states respect for territorial integrity, non-intervention and non-interference in the internal affairs of states all remain deeply anchored in the principles and the fundamental areas of my country's foreign policy. President, in this regard, Algeria reiterates its full solidarity with the Cuban government and Cuban people and calls for an end to the economic, commercial and financial embargo against Cuba and for the full respect for international law, the principles of the Charter of the United Nations and relevant resolutions of the General Assembly. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Algeria. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Kenya.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Kenya delegation sends its warm greetings to His Excellency Bruno Parilla, Cuba's Minister of Foreign Affairs. Kenya aligns itself with a statement delivered on behalf of the African states, the Group of 77 and China, and the Non-Aligned Movement. The embargo on Cuba has been a long-standing contradiction of foundational principles of the United Nations. Today, as we gather here for the 31st time, we deliberate on this affront to the principles that define statehood according to the United Nations Charter. The Charter emphasizes the right of sovereignty and non-interference and also enshrines our collective will towards development and prosperity. However, despite these foundational principles, Cuba is bearing the brunt of the double standards that degrade the trust we so direly need in each other. A decade ago, a swimmer bridged the 166-kilometer gap from Cuba to the United States, marking the shortest distance between the two countries. Instead of embargoes, exclusion, and punitive measures, the people of such close neighbors would greatly benefit from open exchanges of ideas, goods, and services. Such mutual exchanges lay the groundwork for lasting ties that are vital to the United Nations that seeks to cultivate peace and prosperity for all. The embargo is part of an unfortunate broader sanctions phenomena that punishes civilians in indiscriminate fashion and increases the fragility of targeted countries to man-made and natural shocks. It is also reshaping the global economy in a manner that kicks down the ladder to prosperity that the wealthiest countries touted when cheering globalization. Member states of the United Nations should be bound by international law and an abiding aspiration to a multilateralism that respects every member state as equal. It is all that stands between us and the dangerous law of the jungle, in which might is right. Generalized sanctions and embargoes are tools from an unfortunate bygone era that generates such ill will and such injury that they end up harming even the objective interests of those who wield them. Kenya firmly stands with Cuba, as we have in the preceding years and decades. It is why we will always vote in favor of this resolution, while always hoping that each vote is the last one due to the eventual lifting of the embargo. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Kenya. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Vietnam.
Mr. President, I'd like to extend our warm welcome to His Excellency Mr. Bruno Rodriguez Parilla, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Cuba. Vietnam aligns itself with the statements of Non-Aligned Movement, the Group of 77 China, and the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. Mr. President, the economic, commercial, and financial embargo against Cuba constitutes a violation of international law and runs counter to the fundamental purposes and principles of the UN Charter. For over 60 years, it is the most prolonged system of unilateral sanctions ever imposed on a country, inflicting enormous socio-economic damage and suffering on the people of Cuba. It is not possible to measure the full scope of negative impacts on Cuba's human development. These include decades of lost opportunities for investment in enhancing human capital and productive capacity, which could have been achieved through international development assistance, access to capital markets, trade, and foreign direct investment activities. All of these have been severely restricted or even denied due to decades of financial and commercial embargo, and their impacts further exacerbated during the COVID-19 pandemic. The embargo will continue to hinder Cuba's efforts to achieve sustained economic growth, realize the sustainable development goals, and deliver a better future for its people. As we gear for the future, it is generations of Cubans that risk being left behind, unable to fulfill the aspirations of living in peace, prosperity, and progress. Mr. President, Vietnam experienced firsthand the hardship of trade embargoes and fully understands the damage and obstacles they incur. We maintain a consistent policy of opposing the imposition of unilateral coercive measures, including embargoes, on a sovereign state. As such, we will vote unreservedly in favor of draft resolution A/78/N5. In doing so, we join an overwhelming majority of the UN membership calling for the lifting of the economic embargo on Cuba in this August Assembly for the past 31 years. The continuation of this embargo against Cuba is unjust, unjustifiable, and unpopular. It is unfair not only to the people of Cuba, but also to the people all over the world that have enjoyed and can potentially benefit from Cuba's support and assistance. Whether hurricanes hit neighboring Caribbean islands or earthquakes struck in the Middle East, Cuba always expeditiously sent humanitarian relief. As a long-term beneficiary of Cuban assistance, Vietnam is particularly grateful for the transfer of Cuba's COVID-19 vaccines and the pandemic raged across the globe in 2021. These are only a few examples of Cuba's rich tradition in South-South cooperation. It is an active member of the Global South and currently the chair of the G77. Cuba's contributions to the international community are laudable. It is therefore inconceivable that a country that has worked tirelessly to strengthen international solidarity, given so generously to others, and champion the legitimate rights and interests of developing countries, can be classified as a state sponsor of terrorism. This inclusion has only multiplied difficulties for Cuba, barring Cuba from many banking services and access to financial market and resources. It has proved harmful for the development and well-being of the Cuban population. We urge the United States to immediately remove Cuba from its list of countries that sponsor of terrorism and end its economic, commercial, and financial embargo against Cuba. Such will be the first of many steps to reverse its current policy towards Cuba. It is our fervent hope that the US and Cuba can engage in constructive dialogue and work towards normalization relations on the basis of equality, reciprocity, and respect for each other's national sovereignty and political independence. This will be for the benefit of the two peoples and contribute to peace, stability, and sustainable development in the region and the world at large. Vietnam stands ready to share and contribute our part to foster dialogue and mutual trust in this progress. My delegation wishes to reiterate Vietnam's strong friendship, cooperation, and solidarity with the brotherly and courageous people of Cuba. I thank you, Mr. President.
I should like to thank the distinguished representative of Vietnam, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Trinidad and Tobago.
Mr. President, at the outset, Trinidad and Tobago aligns itself with the statement made by the representatives of the G77 and China, the non-aligned movement, the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, and the Caribbean Community. We also welcome the presence of His Excellency Bruno Rodriguez Parilla, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Cuba. Mr. President, Trinidad and Tobago remains resolute in its principled view that discriminatory trade practices and the extraterritorial application of domestic laws are in violation of the United Nations Charter and of international law, and only serve to undermine our collective ambitions enshrined in the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Such practices undermine global solidarity, multilateralism, and genuine cooperation, which underpin our collective efforts towards accelerating actions towards peace, prosperity, progress, and sustainable development. The economic, commercial, and financial embargo unjustly imposed against Cuba continues to impede its potential towards the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals and hinders the full enjoyment of human rights by the Cuban people, including the right to development. Mr. President, opposition to this anachronistic policy is now almost universal in nature, with the General Assembly having passed this resolution every year since 1992, condemning the ongoing impact of the embargo and declaring it to be in violation of the Charter of the United Nations and international law. Trinidad and Tobago had, therefore, welcomed with enthusiasm and hope the reopening of direct and frank dialogue between both parties in 2015, and the adoption of this very resolution during the 71st session of the General Assembly, when not a single member voted against it. However, regrettably, that optimism was short-lived, and additional restrictions through the Helms-Burton Act were imposed, which Trinidad and Tobago maintains is inconsistent with international law. The unconvincing designation of Cuba as a state sponsor of terrorism also only serves to deepen the chasm of mistrust and further frustrates any possibility for the normalization of diplomatic relations. Mr. President, in closing, Trinidad and Tobago will continue to support regional and international efforts to promote constructive dialogue to bring about the cessation of the embargo in place against Cuba, which significantly challenges the achievement of sustainable development in that country and by extension the wider Caribbean region. Might I add, Mr. President, that in our collective pursuit of peace, prosperity, progress, and sustainability, it is imperative that no one is left behind. For this reason, Trinidad and Tobago once again reaffirms its unceasing call for the cessation of the economic, commercial, and financial embargo against Cuba sooner rather than later, and for the full and unconditional reintegration of Cuba into the international system. Trinidad and Tobago will therefore continue its full support for the resolution on the necessity of ending the economic, commercial, and financial embargo by the United States of America against Cuba. I thank you.
The distinguished representative of Trinidad and Tobago, and now invite the distinguished representative of Colombia to take the floor.
Mr. President, we'd like to welcome the Foreign Minister of Cuba, Bruno Rodriguez, who is present today in the General Assembly. Once again, we would like to raise our voice against unilateral coercive measures that have been imposed against Cuba. Cuba is a friendly country and a member of this community of nations. The embargo against Cuba is one of the measures that has been rejected the most times by this General Assembly since 1992. For the vast majority of states, it is clear that these measures are contrary to international law and the principles of the UN Charter. However, over 20 years have passed, and unfortunately the recommendations of the General Assembly have not been heeded. These measures in particular affect the population, damaging the achievement and the effective enjoyment of their economic, social, cultural, and environmental rights. At the same time, this prolonged blockade negatively affects the creation of jobs and opportunities, weakening the social and productive fabric of the country. Of these consequences, my country will continue supporting in various multilateral forums the call of the internet to unilateral coercive measures imposed against Cuba. These measures, unfortunately, have been compounded by the unjust unilateral inclusion of Cuba in the list of countries sponsoring terrorism. Your Excellencies, I would urge you to raise our voices together to demand once again, and hopefully once and for all, the end of this unjustified blockade against Cuba, which also contravenes the principles of the UN Charter. In conclusion, I'd like to recall and express gratitude for the important role that Cuba has played and continues to play for the consolidation of peace in Colombia. Thank you very much.
I should like to thank the distinguished representative of Colombia and now invite the distinguished representative of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea to take the floor.
Mr. President, the DPRK delegation associates itself with the statement made by Azerbaijan, Uganda, and Eritrea on behalf of the non-aligned movement, group of friends G77 in China, and group of friends to defense UN Charter respectively. To put an end as soon as possible to economic, commercial, and financial embargo imposed unilaterally by United States against Cuba is unanimous demand of all UN member states that wish to achieve sustainable development in peaceful environment. From the first day of the foundation of the Republic of Cuba, United States has been imposing overall economic embargo on Cuba for only reason that Cuban people had chosen the socialist system. Due to prolonged Cuba in the struggle for their just cause, my delegation condemn and reject the U.S. coercive measures against Cuba as the violation of the UN Charter and international law that stipulate principles of the respect of sovereignty, sovereign equality, and non-interference in internal affairs, and as a crime against humanity. We strongly demand that states lift with no further delay the extraterritorial economic and financial embargo against Cuba and delist Cuba from state sponsor of terrorism. The DPRK delegation will vote in favor of the draft resolution on the necessity on ending the economic, commercial, and financial embargo imposed by the United States of America against Cuba, proceeding from principal stance of the non-aligned movement and G77 against all forms of the unilateral sanctions. In conclusion, the DPRK delegation availed itself of this opportunity to reiterate its firm support to and solidarity with the government and people of Cuba in their efforts to safeguard national dignity and sovereignty and to achieve further economic development. I thank you, Mr. President.
I should like to thank the distinguished representative of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, and I now invite the distinguished representative of the Syrian Arab Republic to take the floor.
President, my delegation aligns itself with the statement made by Uganda on behalf of the G77 in China and Eritrea on behalf of the Group of Friends for the Defense of the Charter of the United Nations and Azerbaijan on behalf of the non-aligned movement. We would like to make the following statement in our national capacity. We welcome the distinguished participation of the Foreign Affairs Minister of Cuba in historic debate on the General Assembly's agenda. Allow me to underline the unwavering continued support of the Syrian Arab Republic, whether at the level of its leadership or at the level of the people of Syria. Our support for the resistance of the brothers and sisters of the sisterly Republic of Cuba against the unjust, illegal blockade since 1962. We reaffirm our full commitment and support to the UN resolutions calling for the immediate lifting of the economic, commercial and embargo imposed on Cuba. This unjust embargo is a flagrant violation of human rights, international humanitarian law, and resolutions of international legitimacy which are relevant. We are proud to have always voted in favor of this draft resolution, which has been tabled at every General Assembly session. The aim of continued discussions on this important point is to unify our calls upon the American administrations to lift their unjust blockade against the people of Cuba and abandon their policies which are based upon imposing unilateral illegal sanctions against the people, which are worsening every day. In 2019 alone, these sanctions were stepped up with the addition of 243 measures of a unilateral and binding nature. Regarding this suffocating blockade, the rate of poverty in Cuban families has increased due to the difficulties faced by the government to ensure food subsidized by the state for them. This year, that has cost over $2 billion. To date, the United States of America are continuing their binding and illegal measures targeting all vital and essential sectors for the lives of the Cuban people by prosecuting companies, vessels, freight companies sending fuel to Cuba, and targeting all sources of revenue and monetary transfer, intimidating governments and banking institutions and businessmen and women who are undertaking activities with Cuba in all regions of the world as an American strategy to cause its economic collapse. A number of banks have thus brought an end to their relations with Cuba, including for transfers and purchases of medicine, fuel and food, as well as targeting economic development and international trade sectors, as well as health, pharmaceutical industry, in energy, sport, and other sectors. Dozens of diplomatic Cuban missions worldwide have lost their relations with the banks which traditionally provided them with services due to the fear of revenge and retaliation by the American administration. Despite this, President Cuba still sees scientific and medical progress and has provided medical services to 69 developing countries and provided medicines and vaccines based upon their national expertise. During the G77 and China summit, Cuba bring trust in Cuba to a blockade against it. The Syrian Arab Republic, as is the case of defied ferocious siege in history. Nobody has the right to snuff out the human desire to liberty. Until the end, Syria will stand by Cuba. Thank you.
I should like to thank the distinguished representative of the Syrian Arab Republic, and I now invite the distinguished representative of the Russian Federation to take the floor.
Mr. President, we welcome the participation in today's meeting the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Cuba, Bruno Rodriguez Parilla. We would subscribe to the statement made by Eritrea on behalf of the group of friends in defense of the UN Charter. In addition, we'd like to share a number of considerations in our national capacity. Our position is determined not only by our long-standing and special relationship with the brethren people of the Island of Freedom, but our rejection of the international legal arbitrariness in the spirit of a rules-based order. Together with the overwhelming majority of members of the international community, we demand an immediate and unconditional lifting of the American economic, trade, and financial blockade against Cuba. And we support the provisions of the draft resolution introduced by Cuba into the General Assembly. We express a strong protest against a gross violation by the United States of the founding principles of international law and the UN Charter. The actions of the United States and their